The ninth lecture in the series will be about the Great Depression and its repercussions, and it'll be divided into two parts. The first part will look at Herbert Hoover and his early days, which ultimately led to the crash itself. And it's noteworthy that on March 4th, 1929, at his presidential inauguration, that Hoover actually stated that I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope. Most Americans actually shared this optimism as well, and they believed that in the late 1920s, early 1930s, that the prosperity that they had during this period would continue. However, as we'll talk about, it ultimately didn't. Now, after his inauguration, Hoover planned to overhaul the federal government and its regulations with the intention of allowing the nation's economy to grow unfettered by any controls. He basically wanted to allow businesses to do whatever they wanted to. And in his view, the role of government should be to create a partnership with the American people in which the latter would rise or fall based on its own merits and abilities. Basically, what he thought in a nutshell is, as it says here, the less government intervention, the better. However, this said, he also had a reformist and really humanitarian spirit, and this can be demonstrated in numerous actions. So there's a paradox, really, when it comes to Hoover and the man that he was. For one, he expanded civil service reform. He initiated private oil leases he invalidated several private oil leases that were acquired because of the Teapot Dome affair. He directed the Department of Justice through its Federal Bureau of Investigation to crack down on organized crime, and this ultimately resulted in the arrest of Al Capone. By summer of 1929, he signed into law what was known as the Federal Farm Board to help farmers with government price supports. And he also expanded tax cuts to all income classes, and he even set aside funds to clean up city slums. I've also given you a few more examples of the things that he did here. For example, he created the Veterans Administration and more veterans hospitals to help veterans in their plight after the First World War. He created the Federal Bureau of Prisons to oversee incarceration situations and make them better. And he even organized the Bureau of Indian Affairs to protect Native Americans. And because of all these reforms, as the summer of 1929 came to a close, Herbert Hoover was a very popular successor to Calvin Coolidge. Now, ultimately, all of this was cut short when the stock market lost almost half its value in the fall of 1929. And we're going to go into a lot of discussion about the stock market crash now, and try to answer the question what the crash was exactly. Now, it's all really based on what was occurring at or in the early 1920s. And during 1920 and 1921, the Federal Reserve Bank had set interests artificially low to ease reserve requirements on the nation's largest banks. Basically, this meant that the banks didn't have to keep very much money in their vaults. And this was really instituted to try and solve the post-war recession, which we discussed previously. Now, money supply in the United States during this period increased by 60%. And they basically convinced most Americans of the safety of investing in a number of questionable schemes. And people really became willing to take risks to acquire wealth, which was not the case in previous decades. A number of Ponzi schemes, as they were known, emerged in the early 1920s, and they basically hoped to encourage novice investors or amateur investors to divert funds to unfounded ventures, which would simply be used to pay off older investors as they grew. So there was a lot of corruption and things like that. And speculation, where investors purchased high-risk schemes in the hope for a quick payoff, basically became the norm in the 1920s. So this idea that you can become rich by investing in something and getting money quickly back was really part of the 1920s itself, as much as bobbed haircuts and other things were. And it's noteworthy the banks began to offer easy credit during this period, which allowed people to invest even when they lacked money to do so. So they were giving out loans to people that didn't have proper financial situations so that they could invest this money in the stock market. Now this brings us to the slide here, and it basically is noteworthy that buyers during this period were purchasing stock on margin. Basically what this meant is that they were buying stock for a small down payment with borrowed money from the bank with the intention of selling it at a much higher price before the payment came due. So basically they were buying stock or they were putting a down payment on a stock, they hadn't even bought it, using borrowed money, hoping to sell it for a quick price, for a higher price when the payment became due. And really this worked as long as the prices of the stocks continued to rise. And many people during this period were aided by retail stock brokerage firms, hedge firms, etc. However, when prices fluctuated in the summer of 1929, investors really didn't know what to do, so they stuck the course. However, really there were several signs that things were starting to get bad. The first of these signs was on September 20th, 1929, when the London Stock Exchange collapsed. However, in terms of American investors, they didn't really care about this very much. And the first time that people really started caring was on October 24th, also known as Black Thursday, when the New York Stock Exchange lost 11% of its value. And at this point, key American investors really sat up and started to take notice. And the banks, in particular, especially the key banks in America, conspired to purchase large amounts of blue chip stocks, including U.S. Steel and other corporations that we talked about in this class, to try and keep prices high. Now ultimately this tactic failed, and the Monday following this, the Dow Jones Industrial lost another 13% of its average. Now by this point the end was ultimately near, and the crash happened on Tuesday morning, October 29th, and within 3 minutes of the opening of the stock market of this day, people had been camping in hotels, they'd been camping on the streets, etc. And within 3 minutes of the opening of the stock market, 3 million shares of stock were sold. During this point, Western Union telegrams tripled, telephone lines couldn't meet the demand, and investors sought any way they could to dump their stocks. They were really worried about their stocks losing money. Fist fights started on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and when the final bell rang on Tuesday, October 29th, errand boys spent hours sweeping up tons of paper and ticker tape and sales slips which littered the New York Stock Exchange floor. Now, on Black Tuesday, as it was known, 16 million shares were traded and $14 billion were lost. Now, the banks, in particular, facing debt and protection for their own assets, basically started demanding payment for the loans that they provided to investors under the schemes that we talked about before. And whoever couldn't pay found their stocks sold immediately, their life savings wiped out, and yet they still had debt which was owed to the banks because of these on-margin schemes that we talked about before. Now here's a picture from Black Tuesday. You can see people littering the streets of New York near the stock exchange. And it's noteworthy that the outcome of Black Tuesday was complete devastation. Between September 1st and November 30th, 1929, the stock market lost over half its value. It dropped from 64 billion prior to this to 30 billion. And while only 10% of individuals in the United States, private individuals in the United States, had stocks, so it didn't really affect most of Americans directly, 90% of the banks had stocks, which did affect all Americans. And ultimately, the banks ended up failing due to dwindling cash reserves. And basically, as a result of this, they left their customers penniless. Now, the causes of the crash were multifold, and it is noteworthy that this didn't occur in a vacuum, nor was it the cause of the Great Depression, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Rather, this was kind of the tipping point where the weaknesses in the U.S. economy, specifically the banking system, which we've already talked about before, really came to the fore and collapsed. And there were really three primary reasons for the crash. Firstly, and you have all of these here, the international economic woes, poor income distribution, and psychology of public confidence. And we're going to deal with each one of these points one by one. First, the international economic woes. Now, after World War I, America's allies and Germany and Austria had disastrous economies. They were unable to pay debts. They were unable to repay their debts to the U.S. and others. And the Allies tried to get reparations from Germany and Austria to do this. However, the economies were struggling and couldn't repay their loans, despite loans that the U.S. provided to assist with their payments. And the U.S. also refused to forgive the loans that they'd offered these countries. And American banks gave additional private loans to foreign governments who used them to repay the debt to the U.S. government, basically shifting their obligations to private banks. So it's basically a big mess of loans and banks and all of that sort of thing, which is affecting the European economy. Now, ultimately, when the countries began to default on the loans that the private banks had been giving them in the second wave that I just talked about, this put more strain on the U.S. banks, which sought to liquidate all of these European loans at the first sight of the stock market crisis. All right, so that's the first point. The second point is poor income distribution. And this was particularly, this really compounded the problem. Now, a strong stock market relies on the buyers of today becoming the sellers of tomorrow. And therefore, there always needs to be new buyers within the market. However, this was not the case in the 1920s. Basically, 80% of American families had no savings and thus could not invest in the stock market. And about 0.5% to 1% controlled 1/3 of the wealth, people like Rockefeller and others that we've already talked about. And basically this meant that no new buyers were coming into the marketplace. So there was nowhere for sellers to unload their stocks as speculation came to a close. And moreover, a vast majority of Americans also lost their savings when banks closed, lost their jobs as investment in businesses and industries came to a halt, and really had no money to spend after this happened. So the lack of money really was a cause of the crash. Lastly, the psychology of public confidence was a very important factor, particularly the contagion effect of panic. Panic basically was a disease during this period. And partially because Americans had the inability to weather market volatility because of limited cash, this really took hold in the American economy, and people started selling their stocks at the first sight of danger. This brings us to the second part of the lecture, namely the aftermath of the crash and the Great Depression, as it has been known. Now, after the crash, Hoover announced that the economy was fundamentally sound. In fact, those are the exact words that he used, fundamentally sound. And on the last day of trading in 1929, the New York Stock Exchange held its annual party with confetti and music and illegal alcohol. And the Department of Labor predicted that 1930 would be a splendid year. They thought the economy would recover, it would be great. And this is not really a baseless prediction, because markets traditionally do often correct themselves. However, this time there was no correction. And in fact, there was an abrupt shock from the crash, followed by a devastating depression. Investors and the public withdrew all of their money from the banks by the thousands, fearing the banks would go under. And the bank runs really pushed banks into insolvency. And the contagion effect that we talked about in the previous section grew very quickly, since investors invested little in new or expanding businesses. And two key industries in the economy at the time, the automotive and construction industry, were really hit hard by the Depression. Luxury cars, as a matter of fact, stopped being made until 1949 because of the Great Depression. And it was actually 30 years before a new hotel or theater was built in New York City after 1929. Now, ultimately, the limited purchasing power by consumers and businesses ultimately led to the downfall of the economy. And even those who made a modest living stopped consuming as much as they did in the 1920s. So as a result, employers began to lay off workers. And the country's GDP actually dropped 25% in the first year, and wages declined by $4 billion. Here's an illustration or a picture of the bank runs from 1929. And ultimately, all of these points really resulted in a new reality for Americans. Daily life was affected in a number of ways as a result of the 1929 crash and the ensuing Depression. Wages dropped everywhere. This really hurt cities who struggled to collect property taxes and had to lay off civil servants like teachers and police, which hurt education and hurt crime prevention. However, it's noteworthy that at first hardships were not really visible. And in fact, the unemployed really stayed out of the public view. However, after a while, long bread lines of unemployed men could be seen waiting for a meal. So very quickly did this reality really hit the public state of mind. When reality hit, companies started firing workers and even tore down employee housing to avoid paying taxes on it. Family life was thrown into disarray. Marriage and birth rates declined during this period. And women, children, minorities, and the working classes in particular struggled the most. In fact, parents during this period sent children to beg for food at restaurants and stores to save themselves from the disgrace of begging to these institutions. Children dropped out of school. Very few teenagers went to college. However, it's noteworthy that in many rural areas things went on as usual. The schools continued, and the families in the rural areas adapted by growing more in gardens and canning and preserving. They started sewing their own clothes. However, it's noteworthy that there were also about 200,000 men. It's been estimated that there were 200,000 children that roamed around the countryside as vagrants. And there was also the Great Dust Bowl in the Midwest, which we'll discuss in a minute, that resulted in large numbers of people in the countryside moving out because of a lack of a sustainable life. Here's a picture of the bread lines, which, as I meant, stretched for yards and yards and yards. Now, in terms of the realities for Americans, there are also numerous other realities, particularly in terms of women. Women during this period sought jobs because they needed money and were often derided by men and criticized by men for doing this. The men thought that the jobs should go to unemployed men and not to women who should be working at home. But it was not really feasible for women to do this. They needed money in many cases. And as a result, women during this period took what were known as pink-collar jobs, namely jobs that were normally or traditionally held by women, such as telephone operators, social workers, secretaries. And it's also noteworthy that the fact that white women were working often came at the expense of black women. And black women during this period had much fewer options. And it's noteworthy that African American men and women actually experienced unemployment that were at double or triple the rate of whites during this period. And by 1932, nearly 50% of African Americans were unemployed in the United States. And a large portion of this was related to the racism and the other issues that were discussed in previous lectures. Apart from women, apart from African Americans, it's noteworthy that farmers in many areas, particularly in the Dust Bowl, could not afford to pay off loans. They lost their homes due to foreclosures by desperate bankers. And between 1930 and 1935, nearly 750,000 family farms disappeared because of foreclosure or bankruptcy, particularly in the Dust Bowl region. This brings us to the Dust Bowl itself. And the Dust Bowl is ultimately, or was ultimately, rooted in a variety of factors which actually transpired earlier in the 20th century. Now, in the early 20th century, farmers and ranchers fell into numerous bad practices, including mortgaging their farms and borrowing money against future production in order to expand their farms and to get more possibilities to grow crops. Now, during the recession of 1921, a lot of farmers lost money, and they sought to recoup through economies of scale. Basically, what I mean by this is that farmers started trying to grow more and more crops. And in order to do this, they plowed under native grass to plant acre after acre of wheat, and they had little regard for the long-term effects of soil, and they basically stopped doing the things that farmers in generations beforehand had done, namely planting for one season or two seasons and then letting the soil or a field lie fallow and grow up with weeds, etc., so the topsoil becomes solid. Ultimately, this had extreme effects on the soil, and basically the individuals during this period overworked the land. They basically worked the land to death. And when the price of wheat continued to plummet during the 1920s all the way up into the Great Crash, they were basically left with very few options. Things got worse in 1931, in which a drought occurred, which lasted for 8 years. And from this point forward, the Midwest and many areas of the Great Plains were basically completely useless for farmers. Dust storms basically rolled throughout the Great Plains, covered everything in dust, and as a result of this, all of the agriculture in the Great Plains went bust and resulted in what is known as the creation of Dust Bowl. As a result of this, many farmers just simply walked away, and this is true especially in Oklahoma. And the displaced farmers in Oklahoma were known as Okies after their state. And this is a story which was made famous by John Steinbeck's novel, which I'm sure a lot of you have read, known as The Grapes of Wrath, which we'll discuss more about in a later section of this lecture. Here's a picture of the dust storms. You can see how absolutely terrible and terrifying that looks as it's coming towards these houses. And here's a picture of the aftermath of the dust. You can see how much dust is covering this car and wagon that are here. Now, as the Depression worsened, wealthier Americans had a lot of concern for what were known as the deserving poor. Namely those who lost money due to no fault of their own. Basically, they were not the speculators in the stock market. But some 15% some 15 million of the deserving poor, which was about 1/3 of the labor force in the United States at the time, were struggling by 1932. And the country itself really had no mechanism for relief for these individuals. And Hoover was adamant that any relief should rest in the hands of private agencies and not in the federal government. As a result, the deserving poor and other Americans turned to private charities and churches and synagogues and states for aid to deal with the tragedies and the lack of food, resources, etc., which they were dealing with during this period. However, none of these organizations were ultimately prepared to deal with the scope of the problem. And in fact, private organizations during this period also struggled because they had less assets due to fewer donors. Moreover, the state government was also ill-equipped. It is noteworthy that Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who will eventually become the President of the United States, and the topic of the next lecture that we discuss, was the first individual to institute a Department of Welfare in New York in 1929. But there really was no infrastructure in other states, and there wasn't really an infrastructure in cities either. The elderly during this period also suffered because they didn't have the health or resources or ability to work that many other people did. And they typically relied on adult children for care. However, it's noteworthy that the police and teachers who weren't laid off often worked to help individuals, and there are numerous good examples and heartwarming examples of individuals doing very nice things for poor people during this time. In 1932, for example, New York school teachers contributed as much as $250,000 per month from their own salaries to help needy children. And New York police officers also contributed 1% of their income monthly to help starving people in the city. However, these noble efforts really failed to address the level of desperation that America was facing during this period. Now, Hoover himself was not prepared for this crisis at all, and things were made worse by his governmental and personal philosophy. And he ultimately took steps which were in line with his philosophy of limited government. He called for a spirit of volunteerism among American businesses. He asked them to keep employees employed, and he also asked Americans to tighten their belts during this period and make do with what he called a spirit of rugged individualism during this period, which is I'm sure what many Americans hoped to hear. This was ultimately not enough, and the steps that he ultimately took were also too little, too late in many instances. He did create a number of programs for putting people back to work and to help charities with aid, but the programs that he installed were often too small in scale and only touched a very small percentage of people. Ultimately, this made the public increasingly unhappy with Hoover, and he ultimately left office with one of the lowest approval ratings in U.S. history, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on in this lecture. Now, initially, Hoover believed in the ethos of American individualism, like we talked about before, that hard work brought his own reward, and this was ultimately rooted in his life story. Now, Hoover himself was not a rich man growing up. In fact, he was born into poverty, and he made his way through college at Stanford University as a self-made man, and he made his fortune as a self-made man as an engineer. And ultimately, these ideas really shaped his conviction that America depended on the moral fiber of its citizens, its ability to overcome hardships. And the idea of government handouts, which really would have helped the American people during this period, was really abhorrent to him and repellent to him. In fact, in a 1931 radio address, he said that the spread of government destroys initiative and thus destroys character. So this was basically typified his philosophy. It's noteworthy that Hoover was also not unaware of the potential harm of the wild stock speculation, which ultimately resulted in the crash of the stock market in the first place. In fact, he often warned Calvin Coolidge of the dangers of the types of things that were going on in the stock market at the time while he was Secretary of Commerce. However, he never issued a stern warning once he became president because he didn't want to create a panic. And after the crash, he decided, well, now it's time to do something, so he immediately summoned leading industrialists to Washington, urging them to maintain current wages. He ensured owners that they had nothing to worry about. He met with utility companies and railroad executives and elicited promises of billions for new construction projects. He persuaded Congress to pass a $160 million tax cut to bolster American incomes. And really, this ultimately led Americans to believe that the president was doing basically what he could do. However, these modest steps were really not enough. And by 1931, Hoover recognized the need for more government intervention. So what he did in 1931 was he created the President's Emergency Committee for Employment, also known as the PECE, which was later renamed, and you have this on the slide there, the President's Organization of Unemployed Relief, or POR. However, this didn't provide direct assistance, and instead it assisted state and private relief agencies like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army or the YMCA, etc. And he really urged people of means to donate to the poor, and he himself gave significant donations, though this really could not alleviate the poverty that the country was experiencing. Now, as opposed to Hoover, Congress wanted a more direct response. And between 1930 and 1931, they wanted to pass a bill for $60 million for drought victims, particularly those in the Dust Bowl. They wanted to give them food, fertilizer, animal feed, etc. However, Hoover was very much against the idea of giving them food. He would give them fertilizer and animal feed, but not food. And this ultimately resulted in a final bill of only $47 million, which provided everything to the drought victims except for the food. However, this was not adequate to deal with the sorts of problems that existed in the Dust Bowl at the time. In 1931, Congress proposed another act known as the Federal Emergency Relief Bill, which would give $375 million to states to help provide food, clothing, and shelter to the homeless. However, once again, Hoover opposed this because it wasn't in accordance with his philosophy, and the bill was defeated in Congress as well. Now, it would be wrong to assume that Hoover was indifferent or uncaring. In fact, he did a number of steps which show the type of heart that he had. While he was in office, he rejected his salary every year, and he donated $25,000 annually to charity. In 1930, he also helped to raise $500,000 in private funds to support the Child Health and Welfare Act. And the idea of individualism really accounts for most of his actions. In 1932, he ultimately ends up relaxing opposition to federal relief and formed what was known as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC. This was ultimately done in an election year, and he set aside $2 billion in taxpayer money to rescue banks, credit unions, and insurance companies through the RFC. Ultimately, the intention was to boost confidence in financial institutions. However, it was flawed ultimately because it didn't give money to small banks. It gave money to the larger banks. And the public at this point was more interested in food and jobs, so it really didn't help his election bid either. Now, as discussed briefly in a previous slide, Herbert Hoover was very unpopular. In fact, he goes down as one of the most unpopular presidents in the history of the United States. And numerous things and places during this period were named after Hoover in a very derogative, condescending way. There were Hoovervilles, which were homeless shanty towns in numerous cities in the U.S. There were Hoover blankets, namely newspapers that homeless used to keep warm. And there was also the Hoover flag, which the public had during this period. Namely, this was a pants pocket turned inside out with no money, attempting to mock Hoover and his policies. Moreover, in the run up to the election, hitchhikers actually held up signs that said, "If you don't give me a ride, I'll vote for Hoover." Ultimately, all this anger stems from Hoover's refusal to give direct aid to citizens, particularly food, to help them to recover from the crisis. And it's ultimately his own fault that there was such a reaction to his policies. During this time, there was also a number of public events, riots, etc., which typified the Great Depression. One such example was, or it happened after Ford laid off 2/3 of its workers during the Great Depression. In 1932, as a result of this, a major strike occurred at the Ford Motor Company near Detroit, which resulted in 60 injuries and 4 deaths. It was referred to as the Ford Hunger Strike, which was a planned demonstration by unemployed Ford workers. And during this event, police launched tear gas at the demonstrators, who responded by throwing stones and clods of dirt. And at the gates, firemen turned hoses on protesters, and police and security guards ultimately ended up firing on numerous protesters. Ultimately, this set the tone for worsening labor relations in the U.S. And it's noteworthy that there were also numerous farmer protests, as it says here on the slide. And the demonstrations also turned violent in many instances. In fact, a judge also received death threats from farmers if more foreclosures happened in his particular district. Another example, which also typifies the sorts of issues that were going on during this period, happened in spring 1932 and was known as the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army. Essentially what this was 15,000 World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand early payment of their veteran bonuses, which were not technically due until 1945. What these veterans did was they set up camp in numerous vacant federal buildings. And they also set up camps near Anacostia Flats, near the Capitol building. And they remained there for 2 months, although the Senate rejected their request in July. Now, by mid-July, Herbert Hoover wanted them gone. He viewed it as an embarrassment, and he ordered the police to empty the buildings and clear the camps. 2 veterans were killed in the exchange, and fearing an armed uprising, Hoover ultimately ordered General Douglas MacArthur, who we'll talk about when we discuss the Second World War and also Korea, to forcibly remove the veterans from Anacostia Falls. The raid proved catastrophic. The military burned down the shanty town that they had established, and they injured dozens of people, even an infant who was killed in the attack when he was struck by a tear gas canister in the head. Now, photographs and newsreels of this attack made Hoover's popularity plummet even more, and by summer of 1932, Hoover was a defeated man, a pessimist, and basically his failure mirrored the public view of him, and America needed a charismatic leader to restore public confidence, which they got in the person of Roosevelt. Now here is the bonus army and the shantytown which they set up. Here is the shantytown being destroyed during McCarthy's actions. Here are the Hoovervilles, which were so named because of Herbert Hoover and his financial policies. And this brings us to the last side in the lecture, namely the changing values and changing culture which resulted from the Great Depression and the fall of the stock market. And this is how we will finish this lecture. Now, in the 1920s, individualism and self-reliance and material success through competition really ruled society, as we talked about in the previous lecture. However, in the late 1920s and 1930s, the arts really revealed a new emphasis on the welfare of the whole and the importance of community in preserving family life. Books like Grapes of Wrath, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the film, It's a Wonderful Life, the film, both of which were late 1930s but demonstrate the shift, all give this illustration that family is now important, that community is important, that what we can do together is more important than what we can do alone. And this really demonstrates a shift in American ideology and was very popular during this period. And all of this ultimately culminated in the election of FDR in 1932 and his New Deal, which really typifies the changing values of the United States and which we'll talk about in the next lecture.